Today we are going to start with the section to whom we generally accused this organ in terms of love, right? That is heart, right? So let's try to understand the anatomy of this wonderful organ, right? That is heart. So the heart is a conical, hollow muscular organ, right? You know other hollow organs like stomach. Stomach is also a hollow organ, right? While when you see the liver, it is not the hollow, it is a dense organ. Similarly, brain is also dense organ, but this is a hollow muscular organ, right? And you see the shape, that is a conical, right? In few textbook it is mentioned as pyramidal shape, or in few textbook it is mentioned the shape of our fist, that is the shape of the heart. But in general it is a conical hollow muscular organ, right? It is enclosed within the pericardium, right? So it has its layer, it has its covering, that is in the form of pericardium, within which the heart is present. So once you cut down the pericardium, then you will be able to see the heart. It pumps blood to the various parts of the body to meet the nutritive requirements. Hmm. So, in order to supply mainly oxygen and other nutritions to the various parts of the body, these organs play a very vital role. Now, let's try to understand the location of the heart. Right? As you can see, this is a picture of a thorax, and you can see a rib cage over here. We have removed the lungs from the rib
सर
cage.
स्लाइड चेंज नहीं हो रही है.
स्लाइड चेंज नहीं हो रही. जस्ट अ मिनट. Is it visible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. So as you can see, these are a picture of a rib cage of a thorax. You can see the rib cage. We have removed the lungs, and now we are viewing the heart. Right. So the location, the heart is placed obliquely. So it is not a straight present. It is present in slightly oblique form behind the body of the sternum. As you know, sternum has three parts. Right. A xiphoid process, a body, and manubrum sternum, right? So as you can see, so over here there is a manubrum part, followed by there is a body, and lastly there is a xiphoid process. So it is present behind the body of the sternum and adjoining part of the costal cartilage. Now what is costal cartilage? Costal cartilage is a cartilage which connects ribs to the sternum, right? So the heart is present behind the body of the sternum and adjoining costal cartilage, so that one third of it lies in the right and two-third of it lies on the left of the median plane. Now this is very important. Many of we recognize that heart is completely on the left side. No, it is not like that. Two-third portion, or you can say majority portion of the heart, that is on the left side, but still one-third portion that is on the right. The heart measures about 12 into 9 centimeter and about 300 grams in male and 250 grams in female. Right? So this is the dimension of as well as the weight of the heart, and that is a location just behind the body of the sternum and the costal cartilage. Right? One two-third portion that is on the left of the median plane, and one third that is on the right. Right? Measuring about 12 into 9 centimeter, and the weight is 300 grams. Right? We move further. Now, slowly and gradually, we are going to the insights of anatomy of heart, right? So first we are looking at the external features, right? So as you can see, this is the heart. Now, currently, in this picture, now, you are viewing the heart from the anterior side, from the anterior aspect. Okay. So the heart has four chambers, two atria, two ventricles. Right? The atria lies above and behind the ventricle. And as you can see, this is the right atrium, this is the left atrium, and this is the right ventricle. This small portion that is the of a left ventricle. Right? So atrium lies behind and above the ventricles. Now, what you need to remember, very important, atrium are separated from ventricle by presence of atrioventricular groove. ठीक है? तो between atrium and ventricle there is a atrioventricular groove. The two atria are separated from each other by interatrial groove. ठीक है? The two atriums are separated, atria are separated by interatrial groove. Two ventricle are separated by interventricular groove. Atria and ventricle are separated by atrioventricular groove. ठीक है? तो दो एट्रिया के बीच में रहेगा इंटर एट्रियम, दो वेंट्रिकल्स के बीच में रहेगा इंटर वेंट्रिकुलर, और एट्रियम और वेंट्रिकल के बीच में रहेगा एट्रियोवेंट्रिकुलर ग्रुप. ठीक है? नाउ from this, now what is very important, you try to understand this. You are looking at the heart from the anterior side. This is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricle, right? This is not a left atrium, this is a left auricle. Okay, so this is left ventricle, this is right ventricle, and this is right atrium, right? So you see, this is atrium, this is ventricle. So in between them, over here there will be right atrioventricular groove. ठीक है? This is right ventricle, this is left ventricle. So in between them there is a interventricular groove. ठीक है? पर बात यहाँ तक नहीं है. There are two kinds of interventricular groove. The one that is on the anterior side, you call it as an anterior interventricular groove. The one on the posterior side, you will call it as a posterior interventricular groove. Right? For example, you can see this. Right? Again, this is the right atrium. This is right ventricle. This is left ventricle. When you see on the posterior side, na, this is majority, that is a left ventricle. There is a slight small portion that is of a right ventricle. Again, you can see the whole of the left atrium with the four pulmonary veins opening into the left atrium, and this small portion that is a right atrium. So this is the anterior view. This is completely the posterior view. Okay. Okay. So let's start now. You see, the heart has an apex. Okay. So as we know, the heart, the shape of the heart is a conical. So cone has a apex as well as a base, right? So the heart has an apex directed downward, forward, and towards the left. Right? So you can see the apex over here. So it is downward, forward, and towards the left. Okay. Now you see the base that is directed backward. Now, very important, you can see over here, this portion is called as a base because it is this portion on which the heart lies. So this portion over where the cursor is, that is the base, right? Or in other words, we can also say as the posterior surface, right? So this is a base or posterior surface. Other than this, there are three surface. Anterior, in other word, we can also call it as a sternocostal as it is associated to the sternum and costal cartilage or the costa. We called it as a sternocostal surface. Second one, that is the inferior. So this is the inferior, and few textbook mention this as a left lateral surface. So over here there is a left lateral surface. The surface are demarcated by four borders, upper. So that is the upper border, then followed by inferior border, right border, and the left border. We'll take it in a detailed form. So now you see, so currently you are viewing from the anterior view. So you are able to see the anterior surface. So the whole area of the heart that you are able to appreciate, that is the anterior surface. Right? Now you will answer how many chambers are visible from on the anterior or the sternocostal surface. How many chambers are visible? Anyone?
Sorry,
Three.
sir.
Sorry?
All chambers, sir. हमने
All
से भी
chambers. No, no, no. There is one glitch. You see, you are able to appreciate the right atrium, right? This is the
Okay.
whole of a right ventricle. This is left atrium, but you are not able to see the left. This is left ventricle, but you are not able to see the left atrium, right? So, right atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. Three chambers are visible from the anterior side, right? Okay. Now we'll come to the base. So this is the area of the base, or you can say the posterior surface, right? So posterior surface covers the majority of the posterior surface that is formed by, you can see in red color, that is the left atrium, and small portion that is formed by the right atrium, right? So anterior surface, the chambers that are visible, that is right atrium, right ventricle completely. So majority of the anterior surface is covered by the sternocostal surface is covered by the right ventricle, and small portion of the left ventricle. When you see the posterior surface or the base, majority that is covered by the left atrium and small portion of the right atrium. Now we move towards the third surface, that is the diaphragmatic surface, right? You see, this was our anterior surface. So this is a base. So now we are looking at the third surface, that is a diaphragmatic surface. As you try to understand this in a 3D, these are both separated. This is the base and this is the posterior inferior or the diaphragmatic surface. Why? Because it lies on the diaphragm. So we call it as a diaphragmatic surface, right? So now this is the third surface, that is a diaphragmatic surface or the inferior surface, is formed by part of left ventricle and part of right ventricle. And majority that is okay, part by left ventricle, part by right ventricle. So now you try to understand the base is contributed by left and the right atrium, while the diaphragmatic or the inferior surface is contributed by left and the right ventricle, while the anterior surface that is contributed by right ventricle, right atrium, as well as the left ventricle, right? Okay. Thus, the anterior surface is made up of partly right atrium, you can see right ventricle, and you can see the left ventricle. So these three chambers contributes in the anterior or the sternocostal surface, diaphragmatic or the inferior surface, that is left ventricle and left atrium, and the base, that is by the left atrium and right atrium. Okay. Okay. Now we move further towards the border, right? So arbitrarily, you will form upper border over here, right border over here. This is the whole of the inferior border, and this will be the left border. So let's try to understand. So if I draw a line from superior vena cava up to this portion, so that will be my the arbitrarily upper border. So this upper border is oblique and made by, or what contributes in forming the upper border, that is the right atrium and left atrium, right? So right atrium and the left atrium contributes in forming the upper border. Now we see the right border. Now what is very characteristic of right border, you see, can see one opening, that is of a superior vena cava and this is of an inferior vena cava, both into the right atrium. The portion or the border of the heart present between the superior vena cava up to the inferior vena cava, that is the right border. So the whole of right border is formed by only and only single chamber, that is the right atrium. Upper border formed by contributed by right atrium and left atrium. Right border, that is exclusively contributed by the right atrium. Now we see the inferior border. When you see the inferior border, you see the majority portion that is by the right ventricle. You can see this is the inferior border. So majority contributed by the right ventricle and a smaller portion by the left ventricle. And lastly, the left border. Right? So left border contributed by the left ventricle and left auricle and not the atrium, right? So auricle are the extensions of the atrium, right? So they are a pouch-like structure and we call it as a auricle, right? So that is formed by the left ventricle and the left auricle, right? So these are the borders of the heart. Upper border contributed by right atrium and left atrium. Right border contributed by the right atrium. Inferior border contributed by right ventricle and the left ventricle, while the left border contributed by the left auricle and left ventricle. Again, anterior surface by right atrium, right ventricle and left ventricle. Diaphragmatic or the inferior surface by right and the left ventricles. Base or the posterior surface formed by the left and the right atriums. Again, anterior border or the sternocostal surface. Anterior surface or the sternocostal surface contributed by right atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. Right. So that is regarding the borders and the surface from the external features. Right. I hope it is clear. So we move further. Right. We move further towards the groove or sulci. Right. So the area are separated from ventricles by the atria are separated from the ventricle by atrioventricular groove. But the other name of this atrioventricular groove, that is the coronary sulcus. Right? Now you try to understand this. Right? So this is right atrium. This is right ventricle. They both are separated by anteroventricular groove. So that is a part of a coronary sulcus, right? Similarly, this coronary sulcus is also on the left side, separating left atrium and the left ventricle, right? So this is on the anterior surface. Then you can see this is the coronary sulcus where my cursor is, right? It goes like this and then it continues on the posterior surface, still dividing the atria and the ventricles, right? So disease of a coronary sulcus, right? On the anterior side, you can see the anterior coronary sulcus. On the anterior side, so the coronary sulcus is divided into anterior and the posterior side, right? So this is the coronary sulcus dividing atrium and the ventricle. It goes finally on the back side where it is posterior part of the coronary sulcus. This is the anterior part of the coronary sulcus. Okay. Anterior part consists of two halves. Similar, you can see on the right side, one goes on the right, another goes on the left. Right? So anterior part consists of right and the left half. Right half, right coronary sulcus lodges right coronary artery. Very, very important for MCQ. Right? So on this sulcus, coronary sulcus on the right side, the artery that is lodges or residing in this sulcus, that is the right coronary artery. While on the left side, there is a lodging of the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery. Right? On the right, right coronary artery. On the left, circumflex branch of the left coronary artery. Right? So again, what is coronary sulcus? The coronary sulcus is a sulcus or a groove which divides atrium and the ventricles. It is present on the anterior part as well as the posterior part. On the anterior part, it is divided into right and the left. On the right, there is a lodging of the right coronary artery. On the left, there is a lodging of the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery. We move further. Interatrial groove. So that is between two atriums. So interatrial groove is faintly visible on the posterior side, while anterior side, on the anterior side, you cannot see this interatrial groove because of the presence of the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. But on the posterior side, now you can see the faint interatrial groove. As the name suggests, na interatrial means between two atriums, right? And you can see interventricular groove between two ventricles. So between two ventricles, na, this is left ventricle, this is right ventricle. So you can see in between there is a interventricular groove. These interventricular groove are two in numbers. You can see on the anterior side, dividing right ventricle with the left ventricle. Similarly, on the posterior side, dividing right ventricle with the left ventricle, right? So there are two interventricular groove. So regarding grooves and sulcus, we first understand the coronary sulcus, or you can say atria ventricular sulcus, dividing the atrium with the ventricle. Then we try to understand the interatrial groove, which is not visible on the anterior side, but on the posterior it is faintly visible, dividing the two atriums. Finally, we looked at the interventricular groove. There are two interventricular groove, one on the anterior side, one another on the posterior side. As the name suggests, it separates the right and the left ventricles. Right? So this is regarding the grooves and the sulcus. Right? So we have completed external features as well as the grooves and the sulcus. The posterior interventricular groove is present on the diaphragmatic or the inferior surface. Very important. You see the posterior interventricular groove over here, right? There is a posterior interventricular groove that is present mainly on the diaphragmatic surface. Remember, this is a diaphragmatic surface. Well, as well, this is the base, or you can see the say the posterior surface. So the posterior interventricular groove lies on the diaphragmatic surface. Okay. I hope it is clear now. Let's take one by one chamber and what are the important aspects which can be asked in MCQs, right? So first, we took the first chamber, that is the right atrium. Like, over here, this is anterior view. You can see this whole area from opening from the superior vena cava up to the inferior vena cava. This whole portion, that is the right atrium, right? This is a small extension of the right atrium. We called ear-like extension. We call it as a right auricle, right? So this is the whole of the right atrium. Okay. So the right atrium is the right upper chamber of the heart. It receives blood from the whole body and pumps it into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. So you can remember like RTR, that means between right atrium and right ventricle there is a tricuspid valve, while between the left atrium and left ventricle there is a bicuspid valve. So you can remember it like RTR and LBL, right? So right atrium forms right border, as we discussed this na, it contributes in forming the right border. It also contributes in forming the upper border. As you remember, upper border was contributed by right atrium and the left atrium. Sternocostal surface, that is the anterior surface, right? Anterior surface consists of three chambers: right atrium, right ventricle and left ventricle, right? So it contributes also in sternocostal surface and the base of the heart. Base of the heart, you remember, formed by two chambers, two atriums, left and the right atrium. So it contributes in forming two borders, that is right border and upper border, and it contributes in forming two surface, sternocostal surface and the base or the posterior surface of the heart. Right? It receives the deoxygenated blood via the superior and inferior vena cava, and finally it pushes the blood into the right ventricle via the tricuspid valve. Okay, so you can see this is the right atrium and upper right chamber. Now, what is very important to understand over here, along the border of the atrium, there is a shallow ventricular groove which passes from the superior vena cava up to the inferior vena cava, called as a sulcus terminalis. Okay, you try to understand this portion, and you see there is one groove in the right atrium from the superior vena cava up to the inferior vena cava. There is one groove, and this groove is called as a sulcus terminalis. ठीक है, अब ये समझने का ट्राई करिए, ये ग्रूव किस लिए है, क्योंकि अंदर की साइड की, इफ वी कट ओपन दिस ना एंड देन वी ट्राई टू लुक इन द इंटरनल साइड, तो इंटरनल साइड पर है ना एक रिज है, ठीक है? तो एज देयर इज अ रिज ऑन द इंटरनल साइड, देयर इज अ फॉर्मेशन ऑफ द ग्रूव ऑन द एक्सटर्नल साइड. मतलब कि अंदर से चमड़ी खींची हुई है, तो अंदर के साइड पर रिज फॉर्म हो गया और बाहर के साइड पर ये जो ग्रूव फॉर्म हो गया है, ठीक है? तो जो ग्रूव है डेट इज ऑन द एक्सटर्नल साइड and you called it as a sulcus terminalis, while the ridge that is on the internal side, that is called as a crista terminalis, right? So that is sulcus terminalis and the crista terminalis, right? we are talking about the same feature, but on the internal side, as it is a ridge, we call it as a crista terminalis. On the external side, as it is a groove, we call it as a sulcus terminalis. ठीक है. सो एक्सटर्नली जिसको हम सल्कस टर्मिनालिस कहते हैं, वो किस लिए पड़ा है, क्योंकि इंटरनली एक रीज है और वो रीज का नाम है क्रिस्टा टर्मिनालिस. व्हाट इज द एक्सटेंशन ऑफ सल्कस टर्मिनालिस? फ्रॉम द सुपीरियर वेना केवा अप टू द इंफीरियर वेना केवा. ठीक है. द अपर पार्ट ऑफ द सल्कस टर्मिनालिस contains the pacemaker of the heart that we call as the SA node, right? So SA node that is present at the upper part of the sulcus terminalis. ठीक है. Still right atrium, right? Now let's try to see its inner internal features. Among the external features, right, it is a right upper chamber of the heart receiving the deoxygenated blood from the superior and the inferior vena cava, pushing the blood to the right ventricle via tricuspid valve, right? And then you see from the superior vena cava up to the inferior vena cava, there is one groove called it as a sulcus terminalis. This is a groove we call it as sulcus terminalis, but on the internal side, as there is a ridge, and that is called the crista terminalis, right? Right at the upper part of the sulcus terminalis, there is a SA node that you call as a pacemaker of the heart. Now, talking about the internal features. Okay. Now, you try to understand this. Anterior, you can see on the anterior. Now, what we have done, we have cut open this right atrium, right? So you can see the anterior portion that is rough, while the posterior portion that is smooth. The anterior portion that is rough, or we can call it as a pectinate part, which has a musculi pectinate, right? As you can see over here, right? So these are the musculi pectinate. So this is a rough anterior part, musculi pectinate. This is a smooth posterior part. What is the feature? This smooth posterior part is also called as sinus venarum, and it receives the opening of the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. दोनों की ओपनिंग पोस्टीरियर पोर्शन में होती है. ठीक है. So this is regarding right atrium, right? We divide the internal features into two parts: anterior rough pectinate part, which contains musculi pectinate, and the posterior smooth part, we call it as a sinus venarum, which receives the opening of superior and inferior vena cava. Okay. So clear up to now. Shall we move further? Again, you see, right atrium, rough anterior part, smooth posterior part. Rough anterior part, presence of a musculi pectinate, we call it as a pectinate part. Smooth posterior part, we call it as a sinus venarum. And it has opening of superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Okay. Okay. Now comes one very, very important concept regarding the development of the foramen ovale or the interatrium septum. Okay. So very, very important. Try to focus over here for next 5-7 minutes. Okay. So this is just a primitive heart where you can see while the heart is developing, all four chambers are open, right? Just the beginning of the development of the heart, right? In the initial weeks of the development, right? So you can see right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle, right? Now you see right from the right atrium, a single crest comes downward from the roof of primitive atrium towards atrioventricular cushion. ठीक है. तो बीच में क्या है? Atrioventricular cushion. So you can see from the right atrium na, a crest has started developing towards its downward side, right? And it is developing towards the atrioventricular cushion. ठीक है. So सबसे पहले क्या था? All four chambers were empty. All four chambers were connected. Now what has just begun? A small crest, a single crest has started developing, right, from the right atrium, and it is going downward. Now what happens? This crest becomes larger and then it is called as a septum primum. But it is not completely running up to the atrioventricular cushion. A small portion is still left, and this opening is called as the ostium primum. And this development of the septum is called as a septum primum. ठीक है? So what happened first? Initially, the four chambers are connected where there was no septum in between them. Then what happened? A crest started developing right from the right atrium towards the downward side up to the atrioventricular cushion, and then it's finally developed a septum primum. But a small portion is left, and this is called as a ostium primum. Okay, so this is up to the development of the septum primum and the ostium primum. We move further. Now what has happened? You see, the septum primum has completely developed and there is a vanishing of the ostium primum. ठीक है, septum primum completely develop होगा and now there is no ostium primum. ठीक है, so first there was a septum primum followed by ostium primum. Now there is a no ostium primum. Okay. Now what happened from the upper portion? Now the small portion will be vanished and that is called as a ostium secundum. पहले क्या हुआ था? सेप्टम प्राइमम बना, फिर हुआ ऑस्टियम प्राइमम. दिस ऑस्टियम प्राइमम बिकम वैनिश and become completely septum primum. Now from the upper portion of the septum primum, small portion is vanishing and forming a ostium secundum. So now septum primum near its roof open up and forms the ostium secundum. And finally, a rigid horn developed from the right of the septum primum. And this is called as a septum secundum. Okay. So this is called as a septum secundum. So again, we see first a crest developed towards the atrioventricular cushion. It develops a septum primum and the ostium primum. The ostium primum vanish and there is a complete septum primum. From the upper portion, septum primum small portion gets vanished and forms the ostium secundum. From towards its right, another crest or a rigid horn develops and that is the septum secundum. So now there are two septum, septum primum and septum secundum. Okay. So there is a septum primum, septum secundum, right? Ostium primum and ostium secundum. Now you can see this is okay. Now you see this is the ostium primum and this is the ostium secundum. This is a septum primum and this is a septum secundum. Okay. So there are two ostium and two septums. Okay. Now you see this way a foramen is left at the time of birth. There is a gap and that we call as a foramen ovale. As the birth took place, these foramens becomes completed, and this is how the mixing of the blood from the right atrium and to the left atrium. As you know, in the left atrium the blood is under the high pressure, so there are chances that blood may escape to the right atrium. But if the foramen ovale is closed, then the blood cannot escape to the right atrium. And because of this, there is one very important clinical anatomy, that is of mixing of blood. In 2% of the patient, what happens? There is a not complete form, a foramen ovale still remains vacant. And this leads to the mixing of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Later on, they need to conduct an operation. So that is the foramen ovale. So at birth, as you know, the pressure of the right blood in the right atrium is high. There are chances if the foramen ovale is not completely full, then there are chances that blood may escape from the left atrium to the right atrium. Right? So that is regarding this septum primum, septum secundum, right? And ostium primum and ostium secundum. Interatrial septum. Okay. Just developmentally, it is derived from the septum primum and septum secundum. Interatrial septum means the septum between the two atrias. Okay. Now you see why we have learned so much to understand this point. There on the when you cut open the right atrium, now you see the wall. You can see this interatrial septum. On its other side, there will be left atrium. So there is a septum between two atrium, right? So on the interatrial septum, you will find two fossas, fossa ovale on the lower portion and limbus fossa ovale on the upper portion. This fossa ovalis presents the septum primum, while the limbus fossa ovalis represents the septum secundum. Okay, so limbus, that is for the septum secundum, and only fossa ovalis that is for the septum prime. This frequently asked in MCQ, right, in competitive exam, right? So fossa ovalis in the lower part present septum primum, while the annulus ovalis or the limbus fossa ovali represents the septum secundum, right? So that is regarding right atrium. The most important chamber from which most of the time MCQs are asked, that is the right atrium. Very, very important to understand. So I hope you all are now clear with this right atrium and this fossa ovalis and the limbus fossa or the annulus fossa ovalis. Right? We move further towards the right ventricle. Right? So now we take the second chamber, that is of a right ventricle. So it is a triangular chamber which receives blood from the right atrium and pumps into the lungs through the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. So as you know, right ventricle receives the blood from the right atrium and from the right ventricle, the blood goes to the lungs via the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. It contributes in forming inferior border. If you remember that diagram, the inferior border that is contributed by the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Then it contributes in forming the inferior border and two surfaces, that is diaphragmatic surface and the sternocostal. Sternocostal means the anterior surface, the surface which you are able to see in this diagram. So again, right ventricle contributes in forming the sternocostal surface and the surface that is lying on the diaphragm we call it as a diaphragmatic surface. Two chambers were contributing in diaphragmatic surface, that were right ventricle and the left ventricle, right? So right ventricle contributes in forming the inferior border and two surface, that is diaphragmatic surface and the sternocostal surface. Internal features of the right ventricle. So when you cut open the right ventricle, you will be able to see the two valve. One valve that is the right atrioventricular or the tricuspid valve, and the second orifice that is a pulmonary orifice guided by the pulmonary valve. Okay, there will be two valves as you can see. One there is a pulmonary and the another between over here between the atrium and the ventricle, that is a tricuspid valve. So internal features contains two valves, two opening. Okay, now this is very important. The internal features of the inflowing part or the muscular ridge, which are of three types. So over here, what you need to remember, right? Ridges, bridges, and papillary muscle are a part of ventricle. Okay. So there are ridges, there are bridges, and the papillary muscles. Okay. Now you can see in the right ventricle, now between right ventricle and right atrium, there is a tricuspid valve. So in the right ventricle, you will find three papillary muscle. You can see papillary muscle. Here, this is a papillary muscle. These papillary muscle are attached to the valve by a strings, and these are called as a chorda tendini. Okay, it is a chorda tendini, right? So in the ventricle, what is there? There are ridges, there are bridges, and there are papillary muscle. From the papillary muscle, the connection that is up to the valve via the strings like arrangement that is of a chorda tendini, right? So ventricles contains ridges, bridges, and papillary muscle. As the right ventricle, as there is a tricuspid valve on the right side, the right ventricle contains three papillary muscle. Similarly, left ventricle has bicuspid valve, so left ventricle contains two papillary muscle. There are three papillary muscle, anterior, posterior, and septal. Out of this, the anterior is the largest and the posterior is the smallest, right? So as you can see, these papillary muscles are attached to the valve by a chorda tendini. So there are three pairs of chorda tendini from the papillary muscle up to the valve. The wall of the right ventricle is thinner than that of a left ventricle. The reason is very common. You see, the blood which is present in the left ventricle, right, needs to be pumped up so that they can reach the distant portion of the body, right? So that is why the wall of the left ventricle is 3 times thicker than that of a right ventricle, or in other words, the wall of the right ventricle is 3 times thinner than the wall of left ventricle. Okay. Now coming to the left atrium, as you can see, the left atrium receiving the oxygenated blood from the pulmonary vein. You can see the opening of the four pulmonary vein. So the left atrium is a quadrangular chamber situated on the posterior side. The left atrium forms the left two-third of the base of the heart. So you can see this is a base. Two-third is contributed by this left atrium. Greater part of the right upper border, left border, and left lateral surface. That is contribution of the left atrium. It receives oxygenated blood from the lungs to the pulmonary veins and pumps it to the left ventricle via atrioventricular orifice guided by the bicuspid valve. So there is a bicuspid valve. Two pulmonary veins open into the atrium on each side of the posterior wall. So you can see these of a left atrium. This left atrium. Blood, oxygenated blood from the left atrium goes into the left ventricle via bicuspid valve. The greater part of the interior of the left atrium is smooth wall. It is derived embryologically from the pulmonary vein. Okay? So the left atrium that is derived from the pulmonary vein. Now we see what is very, very important. Musculi pectinate. You remember that was also present on the right atrium, but on the anterior side. Musculi pectinate is only present within the auricle. ठीक है, तो ये जो पूरा चेम्बर है लेफ्ट एट्रियम उसमें मस्कुलर पेक्टिनेट नहीं है, पर यू कैन सी दिस स्मॉल एरिया एट द लेफ्ट ऑरिकल extension of the atrium ear like projection that is called as the auricle, और लेफ्ट ऑरिकल के अंदर मस्कुलर पेक्टिनेट है. ठीक है, the septal shows fossal unit similar to the fossa ovalis of the right atrium. मीन्स के जो फोसा राइट साइड पे फोसा ओवालिस है वो यहाँ पर लूनेट शेप का दिखाई दे रहा है, तो इसलिए हम इसका नाम देते हैं फोसल यूनिट. द फोसल यूनिट इज अ इंटरनल फीचर ऑफ द लेफ्ट एट्रियम. That is from the left atrium. You can see fossa lunate in the left atrium as well as the four pulmonary vein opening in the posterior wall of the left atrium. Now finally comes the left ventricle. So now comes the left ventricle. The left ventricle receives oxygenated blood from the left atrium and pumps it into the aorta. Correct. It forms apex of the heart. You can see this apex that is contributed, that is a portion of the left ventricle. Part of a sternocostal surface, as you are looking at the sternocostal surface, then left lateral surface, you can see diaphragmatic surface and as well as the left border, right? So this hole that is contributed by the left ventricle, it forms the apex. Remember, only one chamber contributes in forming the apex of the heart, and that is the left ventricle. Part of sternocostal surface, left lateral surface, diaphragmatic surface, and the left border. That is by the left ventricle. The interior of the ventricle shows two orifices. The left atrioventricular or bicuspid or the mitral orifice guided by the bicuspid or the mitral valve, and the second one that is guided by the aortic valve. So there are two openings, aortic opening and the bicuspid opening. There are two well-developed papillary muscle. You remember in the right ventricle, there are three well-developed papillary muscle, anterior and posterior in left. In right, it was anterior, posterior, and the septal. And chorda tendineae from both the muscles are attached to both the cusp of the mitral valve. The wall of the left ventricle are 3 times thicker than that of a right ventricle, right? So the ratio is 3:1. Thickness, that is more in the left ventricle. Right ventricle is very thin as compared to the left ventricle. In left ventricle, you have two papillary muscle with the chorda tendineae. In right ventricle, there were three papillary muscle, right? So that is regarding left ventricle. So now we have completed the whole, all four chambers of the heart, right? As well as the external features, external as well as the internal features, right? Quickly revising it, you see, coming from the right atrium, starting from the right atrium, You see, right atrium from the superior vena cava up to the inferior vena cava. You see the whole portion receiving the deoxygenated blood, transferring it to the right ventricle. Then you see the groove that is called as sulcus terminalis. On the inner side, you call it as a same is called as a crista terminalis. Upper part has a SA node, the pacemaker of the heart. When you see the internal features, there is an anterior rough pectinate part, posterior smooth sinus vena containing the opening for the SVC and IVC. Right? Then we understand the development of the interatrial septum. Initially, there is nothing. Then there is a formation of the crest which goes on the downward side. It forms the septum primum, a small area that is ostium primum. Then septum primum is completely developed. Now there is a formation of ostium secundum. Then there is a development of the septum secundum. Right? So, and there is a gap that is a foramen ovalis. At the time of birth, it gets completed. Right? And what is important, fossa ovalis represents the septum primum, annulus ovalis or the limbus fossa ovalis represent the septum secundum. Right ventricle, what is very important, there are three papillary muscle, ridges, bridges, and the papillary muscle with the three papillary muscle with three chorda tendineae. Right? The wall that is thicker, left ventricle atrium receiving the oxygen and blood transferring to the ventricle. There is opening of the four pulmonary vein in it. There is a fossa lunate in the left atrium. Finally, left ventricle forming the apex of the heart containing two papillary muscle with the chorda tendineae. Okay. So now comes arteries supplying the heart. Okay. The heart is supplied by two coronary artery arising from the ascending aorta. So you can see this ascending aorta followed by arch of aorta and the descending aorta. Now we see ascending aorta having right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. Okay. So the blood is the heart is majorly supplied by the right and the left coronary artery. Both arteries run in the coronary sulcus. You remember coronary sulcus? It is a atrioventricular groove that was called as a coronary sulcus. ठीक है. So हम पहले बात करेंगे right coronary artery coming from the ascending aorta. You see over here, the right coronary artery is smaller than left coronary artery. It arises from the aortic sinus of the ascending aorta. It first passes forward to the right to emerge on the surface of the heart between the root of the pulmonary trunk. You see, this is the root of the pulmonary trunk and right auricle. So you can see यहाँ से emerge होती है हमारी right coronary artery. ठीक है. तो बिटवीन पल्मोनरी ट्रंक एंड राइट ऑरिकल यहाँ से आ रही है राइट कोरोनरी आर्टरी. सो दिस इज द राइट कोरोनरी आर्टरी coming from the is a emerging as a branch of a ascending aorta. Now we see it runs downward. It runs downward as you can see over here. This is the right coronary artery. It runs downward in the right anterior coronary sulcus. You remember coronary sulcus? It is on the anterior part as well as the posterior part. On the anterior part, also right and the left. So you see, coronary sulcus is over here. Right coronary sulcus, right? So you see right coronary sulcus and the right coronary artery with each other, right? So right coronary sulcus dividing anterior portion, right atrium with the right ventricle. So over here on this right coronary sulcus, there is a presence of a right coronary artery. Okay. So it winds the inferior border to reach the diaphragmatic surface. You see, ये यहाँ पर आती है. It reaches up to the inferior border और inferior border से फिर वो आ जाती है यहाँ पर. Now you see, here it runs backward and to the left in the right posterior coronary sulcus. So ये हो गया हमारा right posterior coronary sulcus. ये क्या था हमारा right anterior coronary sulcus. यहाँ क्या आ गया right posterior coronary sulcus. So पहले वो जाती है right anterior coronary sulcus में, then it wind up and goes on the posterior surface. Now it runs on the right posterior coronary sulcus to reach पोस्टेरो इंफीरियर वेंट्रिकुलर ग्रूव. ठीक है. इंफीरियर वेंट्रिकुलर ग्रूव. यू सी पोस्टीरियर इंटरवेंट्रिकुलर ग्रूव. सो दिस इज पोस्टीरियर इंटरवेंट्रिकुलर ग्रूव. यहां तक रन करती है हमारी राइट कोरोनरी आर्टरी. So again, right coronary artery, a branch of ascending aorta, emerges on the sternocostal surface of the heart between the pulmonary trunk and the right auricle. It then runs on the right coronary sulcus, right anterior coronary sulcus. It runs up to the inferior border, then goes on the posterior side, and it runs on the posterior coronary sulcus, right posterior coronary sulcus, and finally running up to the posterior inferior ventricular groove. It terminates it terminates by anastomosing with the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery at the crux. ठीक है, so see, यहाँ से आता है posterior branch of the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery. So circumflex branch of the left coronary artery anastomosis with the right coronary artery. So right coronary artery supplies right side of the heart. So it supplies the right atrium. It supplies the ventricles. But ventricles में क्या? Greater part of the right ventricle, except the adjoining anterior interventricular groove. देखिए ये समझिए, एंटीरियर पार्ट में भी इंटरवेंट्रिकुलर ग्रूव होता है, ठीक है। तो ये जो राइट कोरोनरी आर्टरी है, ये कंप्लीटली राइट एट्रियम को कंट्रीब्यूट करेगी, ग्रेटर पार्ट ऑफ द लेफ्ट वेंट्रिकल को करेगी, पर जो एंटीरियर पोर्शन में इंटरवेंट्रिकुलर ग्रूव है उसको नहीं करेगी। अ स्मॉल पार्ट ऑफ द लेफ्ट वेंट्रिकल एडजॉइनिंग द पोस्टीरियर इंटरवेंट्रिकुलर ग्रूव। नाउ यू ट्राई टू अंडरस्टैंड दिस। राइट कोरोनरी आर्टरी है that is not supplying anterior interventricular groove, but it supplies posterior interventricular groove. So जो posterior interventricular groove है, interventricular groove means के दो ventricle के बीच में groove, वो दोनों पार्ट में है, anterior में भी है और posterior में भी है। तो anterior वाले को सप्लाई नहीं करेगी, पर posterior interventricular groove को सप्लाई करेगी, ठीक है। It also supplies posterior part of the interventricular septum, whole of the conducting system of the heart, right from the SA node to the AV node, right, except left branch of AV bundle of His, ठीक है। तो SA नोड को भी सप्लाई करेगी, AV नोड को भी सप्लाई करेंगी, पर लेफ्ट ब्रांच ऑफ AV बंडल ऑफ His है उसको सप्लाई नहीं करेंगे, ठीक है। तो दैट इज ऑफ अ राइट कोरोनरी आर्टरी। नाउ कमिंग टू लेफ्ट कोरोनरी आर्टरी, इज लार्जर देन राइट कोरोनरी आर्टरी। So left coronary artery larger than right coronary artery. It arises from the left posterior aortic sinus of ascending aorta. The artery first runs forward and to the left and emerges बिटवीन पल्मोनरी ट्रंक एंड लेफ्ट ऑरिकल। यहाँ पर क्या है, पल्मोनरी ट्रंक और राइट ऑरिकल के बीच में राइट कोरोनरी आर्टरी, पल्मोनरी ट्रंक और लेफ्ट ऑरिकल के बीच में लेफ्ट कोरोनरी आर्टरी, ठीक है। नाउ जैसे ही वो इमर्ज होती है तुरंत ही एक ब्रांच दे देगी, ठीक है। हियर इट गिव्स अ ब्रांच दैट इज एंटीरियर इंटरवेंट्रिकुलर ब्रांच। इन फ्यू टेक्स्ट बुक इट इज मेंशन लेफ्ट एंटीरियर डिसेंडिंग आर्टरी, ठीक है। व्हाट इट इज सेड, एंटीरियर इंटरवेंट्रिकुलर ब्रांच मीन्स के ये दो वेंट्रिकल है ना, राइट वेंट्रिकल, यहाँ पर आएगा राइट वेंट्रिकल और ये आएगा लेफ्ट वेंट्रिकल, इसके बीच में ये जो ग्रूव है कौन सा है, एंटीरियर interventricular groove. So anterior interventricular, if you remember, right coronary artery does not supply anterior interventricular groove. Why? Because it is supplied by the left coronary artery, ठीक है। तो यहाँ पर तुरंत ही एक ब्रांच दे देती है, that is a anti left anterior interventricular branch which runs downward in the groove of the same name। मीन्स कि क्या नाम है ग्रूव का, एंटीरियर इंटरवेंट्रिकुलर ग्रूव, और ब्रांच का नाम भी है एंटीरियर इंटरवेंट्रिकुलर ब्रांच एज ए ब्रांच ऑफ अ लेफ्ट कोरोनरी आर्टरी, ठीक है। ठीक है, तो यहाँ पर ये आई लेफ्ट कोरोनरी आर्टरी बिटवीन पल्मोनरी ट्रंक एंड लेफ्ट ऑरिकल, और आते ही उसने एक नीचे की ओर पर ब्रांच दे दी, दैट इज anterior interventricular branch running on the anterior interventricular groove, ठीक है। then it runs on the left side। जैसे ही वो लेफ्ट साइड में गई ना, उसका नाम यहाँ पर चेंज हो जाएगा, उसका नाम अब हो जाएगा सर्कमफ्लेक्स ब्रांच ऑफ द लेफ्ट कोरोनरी आर्टरी, है वही, पर नाउ यू सी द फर्दर कंटिन्यूएशन ऑफ द लेफ्ट कोरोनरी आर्टरी इज कॉल्ड एज द सर्कमफ्लेक्स आर्टरी। After giving off the anterior interventricular branch, the artery run to the left in the left anterior coronary sulcus। तो ये आगे अभी रन कर रही है लेफ्ट कोरोनरी सल्कस में। It winds round the left border of the heart and continues in the left posterior coronary sulcus near the posterior interventricular groove It terminates by anastomosing with the right coronary artery. Finally ये किसके साथ anastomosis कर लेती है? Right coronary artery. So it supplies left atrium, ventricles के अंदर greater part of the left ventricle except posterior interventricular groove because it was supplied by right coronary artery. A small portion of the left ventricle adjoining the anterior ventricular groove. Okay. Anterior part of interventricular septum and part of left branch of AV bundle of his. You see, the whole conducting system was supplied by coronary artery, right coronary artery, but a small portion, that is left branch of AV bundle, that is supplied by the circumflex branch or the left coronary artery. So the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery supplies the whole of the heart. Again, फिर से हम बात करते हैं. Let's do the revision. You see, ascending aorta में से right coronary और left coronary artery आएगी. Right coronary artery emerges between the right auricle and the pulmonary trunk. It goes downward on the right anterior coronary sulcus up to the inferior border. Then it goes on the posterior side. Now it is running on the posterior right coronary sulcus up to the posterior interventricular groove. Thus it supplies the many portion of the right atrium. Ventricle के अंदर क्या? Right ventricle except anterior interventricular groove because it is supplied by posterior left coronary artery. And it supplies posterior part of interventricular system septum. Anterior part is supplied by left ventricular artery, left coronary artery, and the whole conducting system except the small portion, that is left branch of AV bundle. Then we talk about left coronary artery. It is larger than the right coronary artery. It is also coming between the left auricle and the left and the pulmonary trunk. Over here, it gives a branch which runs on the anterior interventricular groove. The branch is anterior interventricular branch running on the anterior interventricular groove. Then this left coronary artery goes on the posterior surface. Now it is called as a circumflex branch of left coronary artery. It runs and finally it runs on the left coronary sulcus, posterior left coronary sulcus, and finally it ends up by anastomosing with the right coronary artery. So that is regarding it supplies left atrium ventricles. You see, it supplies posterior interventricular groove. It does not supply anterior interventricular groove. It supplies anterior part of the interventricular septum and not the posterior part of the interventricular system. And lastly, a small portion from the AV bundle. So that is from the heart. Okay. I know I have taken these portions slightly fast, but still, if you have any doubt, you can ask me. Any doubts or any portion you want to repeat it? Be free. If you have any doubts or if you want to repeat me any portion, I can do it. Otherwise, we can solve few MCQs. No one? हेलो. ओके. पता चला सबको?
हाँ
Yes,
सर.
sir.
Okay, okay.
Yes, sir.
Then let's try to solve few MCQ. The fossa ovalis in the interatrial septum developmentally represents.
Septum primus. Septum.
क्या है का आंसर?
सेप्टम प्राइमम.
सेप्टम
Primus.
प्राइमम है ना. सेप्टम प्राइमम. The limbus fossa ovalis or the annulus fossa ovalis, that is by the septum second. So fossa ovalis is a depression present in the intra-atrial septum of the adult heart. During development, a thin portion called septum primum forms first between the two atria. After birth, its lower part remains as the fossa ovalis. Therefore, fossa ovalis represents the septum primum. Which structure forms the major part of the base of the heart?
लेफ्ट वेंट्रिकल.
No.
Left atrium.
Left atrium, correct. If you remember, the base or the posterior surface mainly contributed by two chambers, 2/3 by left atrium and 1/3 by right atrium. ठीक है, शायद आप जिसका आंसर बता रहे हैं ना, that was a diaphragmatic surface or the inferior surface, right? The posterior surface or the base majorly 2/3 by the left atrium and 1/3 by the left atrium. The right coronary artery usually supplies all of the following except
Anterior part of
Anterior part of interventricular septum.
anterior part of interventricular septum. Okay. So this is the anterior part of the interventricular septum is mainly supplied by the left coronary artery through the anterior interventricular branch. The right coronary artery mainly supplies the posterior part of interventricular septum, right atrium, and most of the right ventricle. So anterior ventricular septum is the exception. Right? The musculi pectini in the left atrium are mainly confined to
auricle.
auricle, correct. You see, majorly it was present in the right atrium. Right atrium anterior portion, we call it as a rough because of the presence of this musculi pectinate. But on the left atrium, the whole portion is soft, except or the smooth, except the small portion that is of a auricle. So the correct answer is auricle. Which groove lodges the circumflex branch of left coronary artery?
B. Left part of coronary sulcus.
Correct. Left part of the coronary sulcus. The coronary sulcus, that is the atrioventricular groove, separates atria from the ventricle. Its left part contains the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery as it winds around the left side of the heart. Therefore, the correct answer is the left part of coronary sulcus. The sulcus terminalis externally corresponds internally to the
Crista terminalis.
correct. You see, sulcus terminalis is the groove on the external side, which is because of the presence of the crista terminalis, which is a ridge on the inner side. Which chamber contributes most of the formation of sternocostal surface of the heart? So majority sternocostal surface कौन contribute करता है?
Right ventricle. Right ventricle.
Correct, correct. Right ventricle. Major portion by right ventricle. And small contribution by the right atrium and left ventricle.
Left ventricle.
Okay, okay. So, apex of the heart is formed by
Left ventricle.
left ventricle.
atrium.
Left ventricle. Okay, okay. So that's it from the session of the heart, right? I hope you are clear with this session, right? So that's it from today's topic.
Thank you, sir.
Okay,
Thank you, sir.
okay.
Thank you, sir.